Within the confines of his prisoner of war camp, Doug Hegdel had more freedom than most. Amazingly, this was because he'd convinced his captors that he was illiterate and posed little threat. Indeed, the North Vietnamese soldiers who held him even called him the incredibly stupid one. But Hegdel was far from a simpleton, and he'd outsmarted his jailers greatly to the advantage of his fellow prisoners. Douglas Brent Hegdel III, more commonly known simply as Doug, was born into a Norwegian Lutheran family in September 1946. He attended school in his hometown of Clark, South Dakota, before enlisting with the U.S. Navy at 20 years of age. Reportedly, Hegdel enlisted in the Navy in order to travel the world. Indeed, according to military.com, he once told a Navy reporter that he'd never been east of his uncle's Dairy Queen stand in Glenwood, Minnesota, or west of his aunt's house in Phoenix, Arizona. But he was soon to see more of foreign shores than he could have possibly bargained for. As a seaman apprentice, Hegdel was assigned to the USS Canberra, which had seen active service in the Pacific during World War II. The warship also engaged in 5 missions to Vietnam between 1965 and 1969. During these deployments, her formidable weapons were used as support for U.S. soldiers on the ground. So on April 6, 1967, some 6 months after he joined the Navy, Hegdel was on night watch duty as the Canberra patrolled the Gulf of Tonkin. This part of the South China Sea lies off the northeastern coast of what was then North Vietnam. Interestingly, the Bay of Tonkin had first become familiar to Americans in 1964. At that time, President Lyndon B. Johnson said North Vietnamese forces had attacked U.S. Navy ships. This was the spark that ultimately dragged the U.S. into the Vietnam War. Indeed, the country first committed ground troops to Vietnam in 1965. But let's get back to April 6, 1967. That night, the USS Canberra was some 3 miles off the North Vietnamese coast, firing her 5-inch guns. So Hegdel decided that he wanted a better view of the fireworks, but this turned out to be a big mistake. After all, when these heavy naval guns are fired, they cause a powerful shockwave in their immediate surroundings. When he went on deck to watch the guns firing then, Hegdel discovered just how powerful these shockwaves could be. Indeed, a blast blew him off the ship and into the sea. Unfortunately, too, it seems that nobody saw this happen, and it was 2 days before the alarm was raised that Hegdel was missing. Alas, this was far too late for the ship to rescue him from the waters of the Gulf of Tonkin. Hegdel therefore found himself in the sea with nothing more than the clothes he'd been wearing. He was even minus the glasses he wore to correct his short-sightedness. So, as he was 3 miles from the shore, he apparently figured that the only thing for it was to start swimming. Then, as dawn broke, he reportedly thought he saw land and swam in that direction. Eventually, after Hegdel spent some 5 hours in the sea, the crew of a Vietnamese fishing boat spotted him. The fishermen then took him ashore and handed him over to Viet Cong militia, who promptly gave him a ferocious beating. So began Hegdel's life as a prisoner of war. Hegdel was subsequently taken to the infamous Ha Lo prison in the North Vietnamese capital of Hanoi. This prison became better known by the ironic nickname the American prisoners held there gave it, the Hanoi Hilton. It was also a byword for the ill treatment of American POWs. While a resident at the Hanoi Hilton, Hegdel was subjected to intense interrogation by the disbelieving North Vietnamese. It seems that they found his story that he'd fallen off a U.S. warship by accident completely implausible. And despite Hegdel's fervent denials, the interrogators were convinced that the American must be a spy. Hegdel then hit upon what turned out to be a smart tactic. He played dumb. And eventually he managed to convince his captors that he was not a highly dangerous espionage agent. Still, the interrogators wanted Hegdel to write a full confession about his war crimes. So Hegdel enthusiastically agreed, before apparently revealing that he could neither read nor write. He was only a poor peasant, he said. Finally then, the North Vietnamese were convinced that Hegdel was as stupid as he was pretending to be, and they gave up on him. After all, Hegdel was definitely not in the same mold as most of his fellow prisoners. For one thing, neither all the others were pilots who'd been shot down, plus they were mostly older than Hegdel and of much higher ranks. Unbeknownst to his captors, though, Hegdel struck up a firm friendship with his cellmate, Lieutenant Commander Richard A. Stratton. Stratton was a pilot who'd been captured just a few months earlier after parachuting from his stricken A-4 Skyhawk. The story of Stratton's capture was both unfortunate and extraordinary. On January 5, 1967, Stratton had been on a mission to bomb a ferry and so had released one of the missiles suspended beneath the wing of his plane. After the moment of release, the rocket should have blasted off to its target, but this time it failed to ignite until it was behind Stratton's plane. The missile then had damaged Stratton's engine and forced him to eject. Fortunately, Stratton was the kind of man who could see the funny side to the story of having destroyed his own plane. So while staying at the Hanoi Hilton, Stratton discovered that this young cellmate had some extraordinary talents. For example, Hegdel could recite the Gettysburg Address backwards, and he had an excellent memory. Therefore, Stratton and others set about passing on details to him about as many American prisoners as they could. These Hegdel was able to memorize. This was important because the North Vietnamese had never given lists of captured men to the American authorities. Sometime later, though, the North Vietnamese planned to release some inmates because they believed it would be a strategic propaganda action. And while the prisoners had made a pact that they would only accept freedom if they were all let go at once, there were obvious advantages to allowing Hegdel to be released. Still, in the end, Stratton had to give Hegdel a direct order before he would agree to the release that would separate him from his buddies at the Hanoi Hilton. And on August 5, 1969, Hegdel was freed after 852 days as a prisoner. In his head, he held the details of 256 American prisoners, memorized to the tune of Old MacDonald Had a Farm. Hegdel subsequently took his invaluable information back to the authorities, and he even confronted the North Vietnamese negotiators at the 1970 peace talks in Paris with the truth about their treatment of prisoners. So, the incredibly stupid one turned out to have been a whole lot smarter than his captors could have ever dreamed.